lot of reflection lately going on because many things happen. Let me make a comment first about the seminar. Here's one of my deep convictions as far as fivefold ministry. It says that our calling is to prepare you for works of service that God prepared in advance for you to do. Ephesians 2:10 and Ephesians 4. And there's something they call in the church and organizations that usually 80% of the work and giving is usually done by 20% of the people. So that just shows if that's true. Now, it's going to vary from place to place, and I don't know what the latest research would say, but oftentimes there's a core that carries out the mission. And so for us as a church, in fact, the word church, ecclesia, means called out ones, which simply says that if you say you're a member of the church, you're just as called as me. Yeah. There is no difference. You're called to take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow him. I mean, that's as called and committed as you can get if you're saying, Jesus, you're my Lord. So it just doesn't mean that maybe you're called to this sphere of service. I mean, I did not have the grace to speak when I was younger. And it wasn't just learned because I took some course. Really, God gave me a spiritual grace to do this. And so I know this is part of my role in the earth. And clearly, looking back at my life now, God, before I had any idea, he was preparing things. And you have a destiny too. And the challenge gets, how can we be bringing the gospel in the whole world, meaning in this world here, but also in the nations, if we've only got 20% mobilized to be an intentional laborer for the Lord? And then many people diminish their sense of value to the body of Christ because they think, or maybe the category they think of serving or be a person of impact is if I'm really called, then I've got to preach. Well, if we're all preachers, then who's going to be out there? We're all called ones. That's why in the New Testament all get the Spirit. And so our focus and desire for that time is if we could change the math. If we could change the 80-20. If we could even 50-50. Think of the difference it makes. Now, in certain churches, and really a lot of what happens in the church depends on the leadership up here and what they teach and believe and hope. And obviously, you've been taught to fly like an eagle, not a chicken, right? I'll never forget that message, whether you're a chicken, right? You know that one I'm talking about. So we are, and you're very, very significant to the body of Christ, very significant to impact the world as well. So you do have a destiny, and there are things that you can do to reflect on who he designed you to be. So that's really our focus. But if we can change the math, I've done a big thing, even if I can move the needle a little bit. Now, in that 80-20, obviously some people are hurting. They need a hospital rather than, kind of a mission center to go out. They need a time of rest, a time of healing, a time of pouring into. And so I get it. That might be 10%, 15%. I don't know. But I know if the 80-20 is real, then we've got to change the math. And that's what the focus of the seminar is on. You're all so significant to the body of Christ. So anyway, and you'll hear more about what we're doing, but I feel a big a shift going on. It takes a while to flesh out your vision and your dream, and so we feel like by the grace of God, one, I'm grateful to still be walking in this thing, to still be making an impact in the Philippines. You guys brought a team over there, but our dream was always to send Asian missionaries to the least reached. And you've heard our story. There are places where they've never heard his name. And how can they call on the one? If there's only one name given by heaven by which we can be saved, Acts says. And if they don't know that name, it's how can they be saved? How can they be forgiven? And that's why he told us to all be engaged in this thing. So, but I realize there's places where the blue passport holder just is never going to be welcome. And we've got to send others. And sometimes it's not the message, sometimes it's the messenger, because there's an offense toward a certain segment of society. And when Christianity became fused with the Roman world, because it really did after Constantine, then you got the faith being accepted that Romans are Christianized in a sense. Well, everybody who hated Rome would not want the Roman messenger, even if the message was good news, right? There was an offense, and so and God is not, limited by that. But that's why we're all called as his people. So that's what we're focused on doing, is seeing Filipinos go and other Asians to least reach areas. The reason I say I'm in a real reflective mode, and I'll transition into my thoughts today, is because about a year and a half ago, when I was in the Philippines, and we're grounded a bit now because the country's closed, but God is not grounded. And we know that we want this time to be purposeful. But I had this dream. I grew up in Minnesota, although I've been in California since I was about 14 years old. My mom moved us out there. We packed up the 67 Chevy Caprice, and we drove all across. My mom, very courageous to do that. But I was in the Philippines, and I had this dream about my hometown in Mankato, Minnesota. And I woke up and I wrote it all down because I knew it was divine. I just don't fully know what it means. But I showed up in my hometown, and I was there just a few days ago in my hometown because I was that moved. I knew I have to go to Minnesota. I have to find out what's going on. And so in this dream, I showed it, and I know exactly where it was, but I was at this high school called Mankato West, and I heard revival had come to my hometown. And there was a guy there, and I don't know who he was, but he was showing me. We went into this room. It wasn't a church. It was an auditorium of sorts. And he looks at me, and he goes, "Hey, God's really moving." And he looks at me, and he says, "We're going to support you $400 a month." I thought, whoa, that was a little odd. As a missionary, you itinerate and raise funds. But that's not, the idea of 400 was a little weird too. And I was asking someone, what do you think about that? Well, the only 400 I know is there were 400 years in slavery, right? So maybe that's the end of a season. I don't know, but I'm not an expert on interpreting dreams. But then when he said that, I looked at him and I said, "Thank you for saying that." And then I shifted into this thing, reflecting back on my childhood. I said, you know what? Growing up here, my entire life, not one person ever shared the gospel with me. And I wept. In the dream, I just wept. It was very moving. And then, after that moment, I was so glad that God was moving in the city. And now I was raised in a mainline church. And many people were. In fact, I was talking to a friend, another guy I just met in Minnesota. I spoke last Sunday in a church I'd never been to in a small town. And he said, you know what? He says, I was talking about, we got to reach the lost. And this older lady said, "What do you mean the lost? Everyone I know goes to church." And again, that's very revealing, because in the dream, I was so moved. You can be so close to the answer, but because the way it's delivered or packaged, or, even when Jesus shows up, they don't even recognize God on the scene. That you can be so close, but almost the Christian religion, the world religion of Christianity, you can be blinded from the reality of the answer, because somehow, and maybe this is where Jesus says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Why does he warn them? One of the few things he warns them of. Beware of this, the teachings of, because what seems to happen, there's a fresh move of God where our faith and grace, and we meet him and we know him, but then somehow mankind seems to shift it back to, I got to earn this, I got to just behave well, and God's just part of my culture now, rather than a living, vibrant, saving, gracious, personal relationship with the Lord. And I wept over that because no one ever explained the message of Christ to me. And I grew up 14 years. And then there was a table of all this food. It was just, and he said, hey, have some food. And I noticed, it was crazy, but I noticed in the dream there were a lot of Filipinos there. And there were all these young people in sports uniforms. And that's been a background of mine, is obviously the Philippines. And then I've done sports in closed areas and just tried to love people through that, me and my wife. And then there was another guy. He said, hey, my associate's going to show you around town. So we got in this car, and it was this Filipino vehicle. And we're driving, and I looked at it. He says, God's really moving. It's my hometown. I know exactly where it was. And I turned and I looked at him and I said, you know what? It's so great God's moving. But growing up here, my whole life, not one person ever shared the gospel with me. And I wept again. And then suddenly he was gone and I was driving. And I was driving into the darkness down a road I didn't know where it was going to go. I woke up all misty-eyed and having wept. But I had come into, there was something that I saw, just like you were describing, Pastor Eric, the story. You described the dynamic. You were describing earlier what some pastors live like. How impoverished, how challenged, and you're describing all this, and it helps us to see, but until you go there, it's hard to grasp the depth of what people, for my growing up, and I've done a lot of reflection. I walked through the city, and I remember I was born into a single-parent home, never knew my father for a day. You might remember that story. Never even knew his name. We had a name that could be him, but we just didn't know. And so welfare really helped us. When that check came, we'd all get excited because we went out to eat. So when I was there last week, I went to the very place my mom took us sometimes to eat. I found this old house. I grew up when I was 2 and 3 years old, and it was kind of cool to find it because we were there. We were kind of like vagabonds. We just, this place and then this place and this place. And all I remember about that place is my mom used to walk us over this railroad track. We'd go to this where there was a nice man who'd give, the little kid a piece of candy and my sisters. And I remember, but I remember being hi lady, hi man, I'd say everywhere, but I was full of fear. I remember that distinctly. And then my mom said, yeah, it was in that house. You used to get so mad that you would hold your breath till you passed out. And I'm like, what? I'm so angry. And looking back and realizing that dynamic of what I've come out of. And then really, honestly, I feel kind of like I'm a leper today to come back and give thanks. The 10 lepers story. They all got healed, but one came back and recognized the grace given to him and just giving thanks. And then I began to think about key things that happened. My mom was held up by gunpoint. They put our name and address in and then the people, because they ran away because they thought somebody could identify. And then they basically were trying to find it because they thought my mom could turn them in. So I remember just that added to such fear. There was no protection in the home. Mom just said, don't talk to anyone. And, I'm 6 years old, and we had to move from that welfare house to another one. They never let you do that because of the circumstance. They moved us to another one. And now looking back at those houses, I used to think, and I did have a decent life. You just live what you've got. You don't know different, right? But I remember always being alone. Just walking back and forth from school, and then there was this one of the houses. Many. One of the greatest gifts you can give to your family is stability, and you don't even realize what you've got until you get a glimpse. Maybe you see what somebody else got, and you're like, "Whoa! I feel exposed. I feel like ripped off, and every child is born into the world as kind of this open, innocent, here's life, and depending what you're born into, things happen that hit you, that maim you, that impact you, and you need help. And I remember this one place where we were, as kids, we're walking in the snow, on our way to school, and all I remember about that teacher in kindergarten was she was nice. I have other teachers, all I remember was they were mean and they didn't like me. Of course, I didn't know what was going on in their life. Mrs. Johnson. But that day was different because as we're walking in the snow, there was this 20-something-year-old college grad who was a Vietnam vet, and we didn't know it, but he was a professional photographer. That was his dream. He was already out there shooting pictures. He saw us. He took some pictures, and it was nothing weird about it, and that connected us to him, and then he was so kind to us. He asked my mom if he could help us. He signed me up for t-ball. He signed me up for basketball. He taught me how to shoot. And then when the robber thing happened, we had to move quickly. Then he enrolled me in a private school. And remember, and my mom told me about those early days. She said I went to the priest for confession, and he wouldn't forgive me. I was like, what? Sometimes religious voices are wrong. Just because you got the label of some form of this, just because you got a theology doesn't mean it's the correct theology. And realizing, so how would somebody feel if that was the representative of Christianity and suddenly she said she stomped her foot and walked out and he was alluding to, ma'am, how can you have another child? Now, whether it was give me up for adoption or what, but there were voices. Here's a strange thing. There were voices in that time when my mom was pregnant with me because it wasn't in a noble situation, right? There were 2 girls already, and then suddenly she's pregnant with a third. It wasn't easy. And there were voices saying, you should think about terminating this one. That is a strange thing to think that there are voices talking about my demise, my end. What courage she must have had. I'm so grateful. But that guy who entered in, Vietnam vet, a medic, he'd seen his friends killed in the Vietnam War. He'd been through so much, but he showed kindness to us. When he got me in that private school, I worked 3 grades ahead and ended up skipping 5th grade. And you look back on your life, and even though you didn't know God, remember the whole dream of not one person shared. I didn't have the internal sense that God cares, and yet this was all part of the journey. God did see me, and like Cyrus of old, who he sent as a king to rebuild, in a sense, Jerusalem, God had sent this man that brought me more than just words. What if he never showed up? Think about it now. I'm this unwanted child, although my mom wanted me, but it wasn't a day of celebration when I was born. It was like, oh, she's having another kid. How's she going to feed that one? Wandering around in the city and looking back now and realizing the goodness of God to me, because think about it, very unlikely had he not intervened through this man Doug, who was a big brother with a YMCA. He was a hippie, but he was so nonviolent. He was always, don't be violent, Tommy. Don't be so angry, Tommy. I've got 5 earned degrees. I've traveled the world. And I've even sat at the table of a king in another closed country. I played basketball with royalty. What if that guy hadn't shown me care? Here's a couple things, and I do have a text. But the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. The important thing is that you encounter, and my goal today is that you would, 1, be thankful. 2 is that you would find hope in whatever story you're living. 3 is in a sense that you would be inspired to go deep and make a difference in another human being's life. Basically what Pastor Eric jokes with me that I say my comments are entitled, but I've been really gripped by this thought: are you a listener or a laborer? And it comes out of the text, and the text is very powerful because Jesus is looking at all these people and he sees them. And then he's moved with compassion to help them, not just to preach to them, but to help them. Like that Vietnam vet who was actually at his core worldview at the time was atheistic. But he showed me more love and care. And if he had not invested in me, where would I be? To see some of the old relatives, they're still there in that little town. I'm grateful for them. But to realize the privilege I've had, and I was one of the most unlikely to succeed. Think about it. If you're born with athletic ability, you're born with intelligence, but you never have the chance to be developed. One is you realize, don't assume everyone around you really has heard the gospel. Because my whole life I'd never heard it once as a kid until we moved to California, and then my mom heard it through some workmates. It wasn't pastor, it was workmates. Workmates. Look at the impact that had. When my mom walked home that day and said, "Kids, guess what? I met God today." We're just like, what? Because for us, our faith was a traditional religious paradigm. It wasn't a living, vibrant, real. It was like you're in the house, but the lights are. You know what I realized in reflecting back on my past as well? Growing up without a father was kind of like growing up in a house with no roof. The picture, you're huddled in the corner and mom's just trying to help you get by, is nowhere near what you just saw in Liberia or I've seen in the Philippines that you've come to. But you realize that there's people all around us, but we can't see. Even the very fact of what I've come out of helps me to see and be sensitive to what others have gone through. When somebody says they didn't know their father, oh, I see. Many have had fathers, but they were abusive or troubled or broken situation. I'm moved by that. It's very real. But don't assume because somebody is in religion that they know the good news. And please, the good news that Jesus brought is not just words. Please don't just show up and bring people words. Words are so important because they define our light. They define our love. So words are key. But so often, that Vietnam vet got involved deeply, and I'm like, what made him do that? He took me on trips to the East Coast, West Coast. Maybe that's where I got my heart for the nations and curiosity to travel. He put me in a school where I could excel beyond. He invested in my life. I'm so grateful. God uses people. That's why just to be listeners or just to think that what I bring to people is words alone, as if they're magical. No, people wanted to hear what Jesus said because they saw what he did. If you've got a Bible, I want to look at this text in Matthew chapter 9. And again, I really feel like in these days, I'm very reflective. I was praying a lot it was Mankato, Minnesota, where I grew up. And what if he paid my school fees to go to that special school? Single guy, professional photographer, and he worked, he just probably got some job out of college, but he wasn't rich. The investment he made, where would I have been? And then later on, hearing the gospel when Mom walked in, and then God came into our home in a personal, real way, that we are just as loved as a rich person. Just as cared for as somebody who's got a really good, stable family, a stable home. And the whole meaning of my journeys. Here's a powerful statement you can write down that I've learned fairly recently. And here's what the statement says. It's from a guy who mentors leaders and Christians and pastors and missionaries. But he says this: the impact of any event in your life is directly related to the meaning you place upon that. That's Joseph, who says, you meant this for evil, but looking back now and seeing where I am today, God meant it for good. But see, it's a long journey to change the meaning. But what I could do with this story, rather than come and be thankful that I went through all of this stuff, and I'm not trying to say woe's me, I'm just saying that was life. There were plenty of great days. But looking back now, I realize what a gift my struggle was. Many of you know we help needy kids because that young 11-year-old hung herself, the team that went there. Would I have been moved or cared about that little girl as much had I not also been troubled? And it doesn't mean that if you haven't been through trouble, you can't see people and care. But that's a positive that came. Now I value deeply of not just bringing words to people, but investing deeply in their lives. Helping them. That comes out. Now I value education, and we help kids with school. Sending a kid to college, we help kids go to college. Look at all. Your journey as a called out one is part of your destiny. As it's redeemed, but the meaning, you go from struggle, and then you change the meaning where then it can become redemptive and life-giving to others. But before you can move from struggle to meaning, you got to mourn. There's mourning. There's facing what you went through. And then allowing God's love and people's love to enter in and begin to change the meaning. Because I could be like, oh man, I could have a chip on my shoulder and resent anything and everybody. But instead, I'm like, thank you. You know, Fanny Crosby said this. Near the end, she wrote many, many hymns, thousands of hymns. And many of you know her story. She was blind when she was a little child. She was blinded by a doctor, a quack, they would call him in the day, who put some ointment on her infected eyes, and she went blind. Now, without a sense of faith and hope, that could be like, you could forever be raging mad at that situation. How can this happen? How can this be? But she calls perhaps her greatest gift in life was that she was blind. And you're like, what? Because she met God. And I'm sure many people see how God works mostly is through people. And he used that kind man who invested heavily in our family. But look at what the text in Matthew 9, he talks about. Verse 35, it says, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. When you sent your pastor, you know, as he'd been in a village where no foreigners had gone, and they valued the fact you showed up, that you cared enough, but you sent him. That's the idea of sending somebody into someone's crisis. And this picture here is you've got Jesus went into all the towns and all the villages. And so he goes everywhere. So where does our sense of mission go? It goes everywhere. But notice at the end of the book, when he's ascending on high, he says this to you and me. He says, go into all the world. One of these Filipinos I was Zooming with that we're sending, he goes into the very place where the extremist heads come from. He's this young, call him idealistic, call him what you want. He's sincere. And he said, I show up there, he sleeps with the military because it's a war zone. And he goes there and he sees all these kids, no school, no education, no opportunity, no school there. So he's just loving on these kids and teaching these kids. Well, when I think, what if that was me, the kid? And I see this sincere guy who, when they recruit the Filipinos to go as laborers, the guy who recruits, he says, come die with me. I'm like, bro, you go ahead. Because I'm kind of a comfortable American. And I'm like, really, you say that? And he's like, we know. I was talking about some of the ones we're sending, and you know what he said to me? He said, well, because I told him, people get discouraged and they drop out. It's called attrition. He says, well, yeah, we'll probably lose a chunk of these because of, well, I was like, whoa. But there's this young man loving these kids, bringing them a chance to learn. And when he goes into all the towns and villages, then he says, go into all the world. So how can this happen unless we all get mobilized? He wants to go into all the workplaces, all the neighborhoods. And we can't assume our neighbors have ever heard the gospel. Don't assume that. I was in classrooms. I was the neighbor of other families. I don't even know who might have been a Christian or had a real living faith growing up my whole life. There's a need. Jesus goes everywhere. And then it says he preached the good news. What is the good news? Well, what I'm learning, not always doing this perfectly. The good news, in Galatians it talks about the gospel, the word good news, Evangelion in Greek. The good news is used as Christian doctrine and the idea of saving in the next life in Galatians and a few other places. But when Jesus uses good news, he says the kingdom of God is at hand or near you. In other words, it's shown up in your crisis. And why is it good news? Because God shows up in your crisis and he helps you. He heals people. He fed them because he has compassion. He said, I see them. They're going to fall on the road. Let's feed them. And then he says, you give them something to eat to us. And they're like, what? How can we feed them? You might be thinking, what difference can I make? Whether you're older or younger, you're like, what? I mean, the ones that really impact are Pastor Eric or Pastor Tom, who goes to other countries and, or they preach to us. No. Who's going to reach the people in the room next to you where you stay, or the house next to you, or the workplace next to you? But good news is not just the doctrine of salvation. Forgiveness, that's certainly beautiful, good news. But good news is the fact that somebody like that Filipino has walked into the little kids that live on that island where extremism is living, and he shows up and he's going to help them get educated. Good news, we're here to help you. The good news is God cares. And then it says he sees that they were harassed and helpless. A lot of what calling has to do with in my life and your life. Because remember, ecclesia means we're called. You're called. But if you see that idea of calling as a narrow lens, that if I'm really going to touch the world, then I got to be like Pastor Eric or Pastor Tom, you're missing it. Because that may not be, one, your story, your background. Two, it might not be how you're gifted or created. Go be good news to people. He goes everywhere. He does everything that people in crisis need saving from. The good news is the presence of a person who carries Christ and carries his nature, his character, and his compassion to say, good news, I'm here to help you. When we started sending kids to college, before I teach seminary, so I value Bible school, right? Because we think, we only got so much, let's send them to Bible school, then we change the world. Well, you help those that are called to preach. But what about the majority of people? Is it more spiritual to help a kid go to Bible college or to go to college? Well, if you're that kid, whatever God designed for them, they need help to get where they can't get on their own. They need good news. And I said to these 17 students, I didn't have money to pull this off. Like Jesus said, you give them something. You send them to college. How am I going to do this? And then I got a gift for $2,500, and I said, I'm just going to go. That's seed money. And so we had 17. I said, you know what, to these 17, a couple of them went from a whole nother world religion. And I said, you know what, God just doesn't want you to go to heaven. He wants you to go to college. Good news. We're going to help you. When I was 6 years old, and I'll bring this to a close in a minute. When I was 6 years old, I remember there was no money for Christmas. I've told this before. Mom says, bad news, there's no money. No Christmas. Week later, she shows up. She says, kids, guess what? Good news. Good news. There's some nice people. They're going to help you. Help us. They're bringing food. They brought a tree. They let us pick out a gift. And as a 6-year-old, I could see good news. If people can't see good news through you and I, is it really very good news? Every one of us, he said, let your light shine before men and women that they might see your good works. See, often good news to humanity in struggle right now, especially in this COVID crisis and unemployment and all those challenges, good news is the fact that somebody's going to help you get through the crisis that you need saving from. Are you going to be a listener or a laborer? The big challenge at the end here, as he looks over and he sees people are helpless, that means what? They can't do it without help. Had that vet not ended, I wouldn't be here. And he wasn't a believer. He was made in the image of God enough to care for another person, right? Had he not invested, would I have ever gone on to college? It's a good chance no. Had he not invested in me to take me traveling, would I have wanted to travel the world or get outside my little town? Most of my relatives, many of them, still there. The investment he made was huge. And he didn't even really know the Lord. You know the Lord. You can help people practically and spiritually. But Jesus looks over these helpless people and they are harassed. I think what you saw in Liberia probably, they always live in discomfort. The team that went with us to the Philippines when we went to the Bajau, always living with lice. Just because they're born there. And they just learned, always harassed. No rest, always sweating because of the heat, always struggling, where's my next meal coming from? Always, always, always harassed, helpless. Jesus can see them. See, unless you can see, you won't be filled with care. And so your own background, it says, and he was filled with compassion because he could see your neighbor. See your relative. See your workmate. See the stranger that see. Seeing has a lot to do with calling. You and I need to open our eyes. Jesus said, look, the harvest. He said, the harvest is ripe. The opportunities are everywhere. And then he's grieved. It's like, oh. But the workers, they're few. The listeners are many. He had the crowds. If 80-20 rule is true, listeners are many. How are we going to impact a world in need until every one of us says, I don't just want to be a listener, I'm a laborer. I close with this, and I've used up my time. The whole journey that, took a real turn on my life last October. The whole journey of fatherlessness. You know what's interesting of that? I always used to, in fact, it was very potent, you might remember. It was a very memorable moment for me, Pastor Eric, when Pastor Eric's dad called one day. We were roommates before Sarah had taken over. Pastora Sarah, sorry. And it was your grandfather called, and I was near the phone, and I picked up the phone, and I said, oh, hey. He says, oh, hey, Tom, is my son there? Right, I've told this story before. I'm like, oh, yeah, Mr. Lehman, I'll go get him. I remember as I put the phone down, because back then you had the cord and all that. I said, hey, Eric. I just called you Eric then. You weren't yet pastor. But hey, Eric, your dad's on the phone. And then I remember as I walked, I thought, I wonder what that'd be like to get a phone call. I wasn't all bitter. I was just like, I wonder what somebody actually reached out and said, hey, you're mine. I mean, that is a real deal. And then the welfare kid, always feeling like I'm a little bit lower than everyone else because they all kind of look at you. I remember the food stamp line, paying with food stamps. Others kind of look at, would you hurry up? Almost like we're in their way because they have money we don't. I remember Mom writing down every last penny, and then I'm standing at the checkout. She's got her little tablet, and then she's here, put this back. We can't afford it. So I take the can or whatever it was and put it back on the shelf, and then I run back. That was real experience. And so there's this impacts your identity. It impacts so much of your journey, which I said you can change the meaning, right? Well, what happened to change, and all tied to fatherlessness in many ways. Fathers bring protection. Fathers bring provision. Fathers bring so much identity. And I just wondered, is there someone I look like out there? My son did a DNA test. Remember, we thought it was this guy with this name that we couldn't identify. We didn't even know how to spell it. And some strange names appeared in Ancestry. Crazy. This was just last October. And then I took one. And then my wife goes after it. She's more tenacious than me. And then we're in Seattle at the time. And suddenly I hear this voice, we found him. We're like, what? My kids go running in because they've never known, that grandfather. It was always this missing piece. They run in and they look, and then there's this picture, and there's this brother who I look like. And then I come walking and I see it. I'm like, that is creepy. I look like that guy. It was so weird to me. And so, I think you probably have the slide, but we actually found my dad. And I remember because we knew before he knew. He's 42 years sober. He was married 4 times. He was bumbling through life. His dad had killed himself after World War II. He was just harassed and searching. And then I had the honor, obviously, to meet him last December for the first time in my life. And I remember, I'll close with this, but I was feeling anxious. What if he rejects me? Because many of those stories don't go well. But then as I'm walking and praying, I thought, you know what? It's okay. Because I already have a Father. I have the gospel. And you have the gospel. Folks, will you be an intentional laborer for the Lord? Will you be someone who sees? Will you be somebody who, please, don't just give people words. Don't just bring words. People need help. The words must come. Would you offer yourself to be a difference maker in whatever vocation you choose? Let's stand to our feet.